gallery view and stop sharing for a minute while I do the intro. Okay, wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for another rendition in our Rodef Shalom History Series. And tonight, our subject will be Rabbi Goldenson, who was the rabbi for Rodef Shalom from the time that Rabbi Levi had passed away, about 1917, 1918, through 1933. So through the Roaring Twenties and into the Great Depression. So what a time for leadership, right? In terms of our synagogue, and we're really delighted to have a special speaker with us today, D Clarke. Studies and writes on Appalachian and Jewish histories and geographies of anti-Semitism, whiteness, and white supremacy, and poetics of desire and solidarity. They hold an MA in history from the University of Pittsburgh and are a former managing editor of In Geveb, a journal of Yiddish studies. They live in Pittsburgh. So D Clarke will be our presenter tonight. And prior to that, we have a special attraction in that Dr. Ron Goldenson, the grandson of Rabbi Goldenson, and his wife Ellen in Florida, are here. And there may be some additional grandchildren that are also participating, but Dr. Goldenson would like to share some personal reflections on his grandfather before we begin the presentation. So if I could ask Dr. Goldenson to take over and move into speaker view, please.
Can you hear me now? Good. I'm delighted that my grandfather is being celebrated today, 60 years after his death. I'm a retired physician now living in Palm Beach, as you mentioned. And Granddad had 3 children. One girl, Evelyn Glick, and one of her sons, David Glick, is with us today. He lives in California. There was also William Goldenson, who moved many years ago to California to play golf and lead a very glamorous and carefree life, very different from the others. And my father, Robert Goldenson, who is the father of myself and Dan Goldenson, who is also online, as is one of his sons, Jeff Goldenson. Evelyn lived in Stamford, Connecticut. We lived in Scarsdale, both north of New York City. And Granddad often came to visit on weekends, principally to go up to Stamford, where he had a room at Evelyn's place. Remember, though, that he retired from Temple Emmanuel in 1946, and we were born in the early 40s. So we don't have a lot of recollections of Granddad, but I do recall a frail, serious man who seemed always to have a dark suit on with a necktie, even on weekends. Although he looked a little sad to me, he was very pensive, but his face would light up when he saw us during a visit. And when he laughed, he would cry, something I remember quite distinctly. Dan and I heard him speak really only once in New York. David Glick was luckier because Granddad spoke sometimes at the temple in Connecticut. In 2004, my brother told me today that he went down to Granddad's first job as a rabbi in Lexington, Kentucky, where he stayed from 1904 till 1907. And on their centenary, my brother went down there to help celebrate. After being in Lexington, Kentucky, my grandfather moved to Albany, where he stayed for 11 years. And I guess he was quite a celebrity because not only was he the rabbi, but he was also asked to become the mayor, which he didn't do. But while he was staying in Albany, he commuted to New York to get his degree in philosophy at Columbia. He was a great scholar, as we know. And of course, in 1918, thereafter, you were lucky enough at Rodef Shalom to welcome my grandfather. He stayed with you about 12 years and then went to Temple Emmanuel in New York, where he also had a storied career. During that time, shortly after arriving in New York, he received a letter from FDR asking him to weigh in on his proposed Social Security Act. My brother told me he has this letter to my grandfather, which is wonderful. In any event, I think we'll be interested in hearing about my grandfather. I must say, on a personal note, my wife Ellen and I retain a connection with Rodef Shalom through our dear friend Irma Morris, who happens to share my birthday, not my birth year, because she's 98, and she's across the room here listening to this now. So with that, let me turn the microphone over to you, and thank you for this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldenson. It's really wonderful to see you, to meet you, and appreciate your participation. And what an amazing person. So we're going to hear more about your grandfather. And Dee's title of the presentation is Labor Activist. So if I could turn it over to Dee to take us on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill and Olivia, especially for inviting me and making this happen, and Dr. Goldenson for what you shared. You know, something I think about a lot as a historian is the pieces of history that don't make it into the archive. And Rabbi Goldenson has a more significant archive than most people. I don't know if any of you have been to the archives in Cincinnati, the URJ, and connected to HUC, right? But, you know, he's got boxes of letters and speeches that I spent some time in, and that was really exciting. But of course, so much of historical work is also about filling in gaps. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for what you had to say. And I'm really grateful to all of you for having me. You know, I'm engaged in Jewish life. I live in Pittsburgh, but I'm not part of Rodef Shalom. And so I sort of come to this both intimately and at a distance, knowing that I'm thinking about and talking about an institution also that's known to you, to many of you, in ways that it is not to me. But with that, I'll share what I do know about Rabbi Goldenson, and hope that it'll be illuminating, and then we'll have some discussion about it. I've got some slides and sort of a PowerPoint to take us through. I don't love to rely too much on it, so we'll sort of step in and out of that as we go. Let's see, but I'm going to pull that up now. Thank you for your patience as I get going on this screen share. Okay. Yes, can you see?
Sure can.
Brilliant, thank you, Olivia. Right, so in kind of the framing of this talk, right, we talked about, we called Dr. also, right, and Rabbi Goldenson a labor activist. But the way that I come to know about him really and about his work is through a single speech, which I'll get to in a little bit. And there's a beautiful line in this speech that he gives. Judaism was born in a revolution. That really struck me the first time I came across it, and is what engaged me to want to go to learn more deeply about what and how he lived and why, right? Rabbi Goldenson was born in 1878 in Poland, and I emphasize that because you know, so it's 1878, right? Rabbi Goldenson is born in Poland, and then 7 years later, in 1885, the Pittsburgh Platform is passed, codifying the framework of classical Reform Judaism, right? That puts aside rituals which are not for an explicitly, which don't have an explicit utilitarian value, right? That's the moment in which the Reform movement decides to put aside kashrut, which the Reform movement is understanding not as an inherent spiritual practice, but rather as something without a clear moral imperative for Jews engaging with modernity. And one other piece of what the Pittsburgh platform puts aside very explicitly is not just Zionism, and that's not really fair to say historically speaking, but the Reform movement, right? We know already in the 1850s in Germany, where it's founded, separates itself, and I'll come back. Maybe faces are good, but the Reform movement separates itself from longing for Zion in the liturgy right as early as the 1850s, and this is out of a political move in Germany to say Jews can be German burghers, can be of this place Germany, rather than, and it's a way for Reform Judaism to disengage from the anti-Semitic myth of dual loyalty, right, that says that Jews, no matter where they are, will in fact always be longing for Zion in this other place. In 1885, that's codified more particularly to this moment of modernity and, I argue, also increasing, assimilation, whiteness, and capacity for accumulation of wealth. Whiteness being property, as Cheryl Harris, the legal scholar, would argue 100 years later. And the reason this codification is so interesting and important is because it says Reform Judaism is here, that it claims explicitly that America is a safe place for Jews and that Jews needn't be longing for some other place, but that place is here. But this also comes so much out of this German tradition, Jew in the home, man in the streets, as Moses Mendelssohn put it during the Haskalah. And then Samuel Goldenson, who arrives in the US from Poland, where he's born, where there's much more of an Orthodox, what we now would understand as Orthodox, very religiously ritualistic tradition. He's emerging from that. And so it's really exciting and interesting to me to ask, thinking about his life story, what draws him, coming from a more sort of traditional Jewish religious background, to Reform Judaism, and in the process of doing so, totally remakes the ethos of Reform Judaism. And Pittsburgh plays a really important part in that. And that's, I think, what I'm particularly concerned with tonight. So to give you some more context for that, back to the slideshow. Thank you for your patience. Okay, we're presenting Judaism is born in revolution. Yes. And so, right, so like I said, the Pittsburgh platform, 1885, 7 years after Rabbi Goldenson is born, passed here in Pittsburgh, which makes Pittsburgh in many ways the seat of Jewish assimilation via religious reorientation in America. And that religious reorientation allows for a level of access to whiteness that light-skinned Jews of both Ashkenazi and Sephardic origin have often had legally in the United States, but more and more so are having culturally and economically in the 20th century, although that too is shaky, nonlinear, and incomplete. So now I'm going to show a few political cartoons that illustrate sort of the moment into which Samuel Goldenson is working as he takes on his first congregations in Lexington, Kentucky, and then in Albany, and then in Pittsburgh. Right, so this astonishingly anti-Semitic cartoon appears in the 1890s in an Ohio-based libertarian paper. I won't get into too many of the details, but we can see right here, there's a profound anti-Semitism, right? So even as I'm arguing that Reform Judaism, and particularly the classical Pittsburgh platform, is very strategically recalibrating Jewishness as something palatably American, that's also happening in a political and cultural climate in which, the U.S. this is the U.S. in the hands of the Jews, right? It says at the top of this cross, on which Uncle Sam, in a clear analogy to Jesus, is being crucified. House and Senate, right? It says on the bars of the cross. And then in the lower right-hand corner of the image, we see someone who's very stereotypical Jewish man, right? He's got a big nose, facial hair, and he is poking at Uncle Sam and or Jesus Christ. Right here also we have this very explicit conflation of Americanness and Christianity, implying whiteness as well. But on the spear that the Jewish figure carries is a little banner that reads, right, gold standard, puncturing Uncle Sam, right? And so we have this clear kind of climate in which Jews are a threat to capitalism. Capitalism, Christianity, and America are singularly intertwined and in danger on the cross of Jewish intervention and undermining. We see this here, published in a popular weekly journal in the 19-teens, curses, "It won't explode in America" is the caption. And here we have a Karl Marx-like figure, again, right, codes Jewish. And for those who don't know, which is more people than I'm learning more recently, is more people than I expected, don't necessarily know that Marx was Jewish, but maybe people in this room do. But he's holding a bomb, right, that says Industrial Revolution. And this flag labeled red indicating communism. But, right, curses, "It won't explode in America." Again, we have this idea of the Jew who's trying to sabotage American industrial capitalist progress, which we know is really a really strong force in Pittsburgh as we have the Industrial Revolution, right? We have the Rockefellers, we have Westinghouse, we have the Carnegies, kind of these industrial barons of the Northeast, many of whom are based in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh at this moment is also a real and particular symbol of American capitalist progress. And so what does it mean in this moment that Reform Judaism is reimagining itself here, right? It's not on the coast. It's not in New York City where the American popular imagination thinks Jews are. It's in this other place, Pittsburgh, that signifies Americanness in a way that is not so cosmopolitan, right? And we know historically that Jews are often, that rootless cosmopolitan is an anti-Semitic dog whistle that comes out of the Russian Empire, but pervades more broadly and plays again on that dual loyalty myth that Reform Judaism is explicitly working to undermine. Which brings us, right, like I said, to Pittsburgh specifically. And in this question of whiteness and assimilation, in sort of this propaganda that we're seeing from white, usually implicitly Christian, but relatively mainstream popular media sources, this argument that Jews don't fit in, Jews are undermining to capitalism, and that America is capitalism, is Christianity. And then here we have a photo of the men's reading group at the Jewish Home for the Aged in the Hill District, circa 1920. And I put this here too, right, because there is also in Pittsburgh, in the moment of Goldenson's rabbinate here, many Judaisms in Pittsburgh, and some of which here we can see are much more explicitly ethnic and racialized than some of the ethos of kind of assimilation and modernity that the Reform movement is moving toward in this moment. But then this is 1920, and by 1930, most Jews in Pittsburgh have moved out of the Hill District into Oakland and Squirrel Hill. That's kind of, in that period, again, of Goldenson's rabbinate, that's the period in which Jews in Pittsburgh are moving out of the Hill District, Black people are moving in, and that's because of economic racialization into whiteness, in which the Jews of Pittsburgh more and more are able to afford to move out of the Hill District. And that's something that Rabbi Goldenson attends to very explicitly in his speeches. Right, and so this is just a few years later and a few blocks away in Oakland. This is the basketball team of the Young Men's Hebrew Association, which at the time was located in what's now Belfield Hall. For any of you familiar with Oakland or the University of Pittsburgh, you'll know that kind of neoclassical building where indeed neoclassical Jewish bodies are being made. Right, so this is working at every level, this kind of whiteness and this work of whiteness and assimilation. Yes, let's go on from here. At the same time, right, we have this image in the popular media and culture of anarchist subterfuge associated with Jews. This here is a headline from 1901 in the moments just as Goldenson is taking on his first position as a rabbi in Lexington, Kentucky, which is just over the border of the Appalachian Mountains into the sort of flatter part of Kentucky, but very much in coal country. And that too will be important in a moment. But I bring this up here because President William McKinley was assassinated by the non-Jewish Polish-American anarchist Leon Czolgosz at the World's Fair in 1901. And that was a moment, despite Czolgosz not being Jewish, the fact that he was East European and an anarchist put Jewish assimilation and Jewish safety in America at risk, or not put at risk, right? But the state and popular culture increased their anti-Semitism and conflation, rightly and wrongly, of Jews and communism and anarchism. And I say this because both J. Bernard Levy and the rabbi who preceded Goldenson and Goldenson himself engaged explicitly with anarchism on the pulpit. And that to me is very exciting and very surprising in a Reform congregation, especially one like Rodef Shalom that's had such a prominent social role for the entirety of its existence, and especially under Levy, who had very close relationships with 4 different US presidents who came to visit Rodef Shalom, right? And so we have this, again, because of J. Leonard Levy, who we'll see in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to pause this screen share for just a minute. Again, it's good to like see each other's faces again. But right, I say this because both Levy and Goldenson are doing such exciting and interesting work to negotiate between a congregation that's operating increasingly in English, increasingly oriented toward accessibility. Yes, and right, Martha Berg particularly is engaged on Rabbi Levy's life, and so I won't spend too much time on it, but I do think it's an exciting and important context where he argues immediately following Czolgosz's assassination of McKinley in 1901 at the Rodef Shalom pulpit that anarchism and Judaism are fundamentally opposed, right? He says that Judaism is religious and anarchism is about there being no God. They cannot possibly, yes, well, thank you, Olivia. They can't possibly engage with one another. But the political climate shifts very much so that 17 years later in 1918, and then again at an important speech in 1926, Rabbi Goldenson has a very different opportunity. And thank you, Olivia, I'm grateful for that prompting. Anarchism, right, is a term that's sort of, especially last spring with the George Floyd uprisings, is sort of back in popular discourse in a way that it hasn't necessarily been, and is defined many ways in many different moments, but broadly speaking has to do with a political ethos that believes people to be fundamentally desirous of societies where everyone's needs are met and where power is not structured hierarchically, but rather shared among the people who participate in those societies, which makes anarchism also opposed to constructions of states, right? And that's sort of the point of threat. The association of Jews and radical politics and anarchism makes the work of Jewish assimilation into American norms very tenuous. And there are a lot of ways to look at that. Olivia, does that? Thanks. Yes, right. And so what happens is, in the immediate aftermath of McKinley's assassination, Rabbi Levy needs to say, absolutely not, Jews are not involved in this, like, that's not what we're about, right? And he has these very close relationships with certain US presidents. Meanwhile, in 1918, when Rabbi Goldenson takes over the pulpit, he's got a very different political climate, and has a really interesting argument. Let me get there, and then I will. Yeah, he has a really interesting argument, and there's a really particular anarchist history and culture in Pittsburgh that becomes important to what he has to say. So I'll bring back that screen share for a minute and take you all there with me. Oh dear. Okay. Nope. Sit. I apologize. We are in my studio apartment, and my dog is intervening in this presentation. Okay. I apologize. One moment while I deal with this technical difficulty.
Thank you so much for the presentation so far. We really, really appreciate it. The dog's name is Knish, for anybody who's wondering, and it is a really phenomenal dog.
Hello again. Thank you for your patience. We're on Zoom. It's February. We've been in COVID isolation for a year, and I'm giving you this presentation from my house, and my dog is here. Thank you. Yes, I really appreciate your patience. Okay, right. So we're in Pittsburgh. It's 1918. Good. Okay, we're gonna try that screen share again. Oh God. Okay. Yes, I'm shaky from that moment of surprise. We're good. Right. So at the same time that Rabbi Levy is working to distance Rodef and Jews from anarchism, right, and he's doing that not in the old Rodef Shalom building that's downtown, but here's this just like lovely photo of the one that you all know from the period of Rabbi Levy's rabbinate. Here he is. And right here's his speech from the Reform Pulpit, 1901, that he gives at Rodef and then is published, which is very common in this period. And I think this is something that's really important to think about too, is the ways in which rabbis at the time, and this is surely still true, but in a moment when very often their congregations did not even speak maybe did not speak English, or surely did not have a level of English that was publishing in the popular press, or at a time also when more of the people in their congregation were of a class background that wasn't kind of as professionally respected. Rabbis did a lot of respectability work for their congregations, and were taken very seriously as public figures in a really resounding way. And I also just love kind of the Art Deco illustration on this. But right, and here's what he has to say. In this period of religious and social unrest, and with the shadow of an awful crime still upon the nation, right? That's the assassination of McKinley. It is essential that we should understand and calmly deliberate on these subjects, desiring, moreover, to set ourselves on the record in regards to them. As members of our religious fraternity, we are opposed to anarchism because it lays the axe to the roots of society, which I agree is more or less an accurate definition of anarchism from Rabbi Lidji. Which again, yeah, I talked about this a little bit in abstract, but I'll just get into the specifics. Anarchism denying the right to rule on earth has been the boon companion of atheism, which denies supreme rule throughout the universe. Many are ceasing to be God believers and are rapidly becoming materialists. Materialist is one who holds that, quote, the only good worth striving for is material good, and the only possible life is the life here. Beyond, there is nothing, end quote. And that's so interesting to me because it gives us a real look into Levy's theology and a kind of thinking about an afterlife, thinking about, or sort of in a more generous interpretation, thinking about spirituality, thinking about meaning making in a big way. But something I'm really excited about in terms of thinking with Rabbi Goldenson's theology. He tells the congregation at Albany that he leaves to come to Pittsburgh in 1918. He tells them, you know, listen, you are a smaller congregation. Now I'm being called to this larger and sort of more respected congregation in Pittsburgh. But don't think that you are any less important than them. Size is not how we determine importance. Importance is in both depth and access. If in my time, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you know, if in my time as your rabbi in Albany, I have helped any of you think more deeply, which is to say with more meaning about your own life, then I've done my job. And one of the first things that Rabbi Goldenson does when he comes to Pittsburgh, kind of to this point of both material change, the life of the here and now, and a kind of anarchist anti-hierarchical impulse, is he ends assigned seating at Rodef Shalom. And this is met with a lot of pushback by long-term members of the congregation, people who are very set on, you know, they've purchased seats, those are their seats, and the seating has a lot to do, right, with, you know, who can afford to buy the seats and who is there to see and be seen. And Rabbi Goldenson says, that's not what we're doing. Anybody can sit anywhere. I'll tie into that to say Amnon Shapira, who writes on religious Jewish anarchism, kind of points us toward Rabbi Goldenson's thinking. He says, Jewish religion as embodying the eternal divine law is by its very nature anarchistic and serves as an ethical barrier to government tyranny. The laws of the Torah serve as a barrier and shield against tyrannical rule. God alone, not the individual or the state, is master ruler. And that's very much the place that Rabbi Goldenson is operating from, this idea that Hashem is really the only one who can be over any person. And I have here a little clip just from his New York Times obituary. And this is sort of, I know in my introduction of him, but I put it here because I want us to be thinking about the fact, right, that he comes from sort of outside kind of the mainline tradition of Reform Judaism, but then studies, his family settles in Cleveland when he's a young man, and he attends seminary, or excuse me, not Cleveland, Cincinnati, and he attends seminary there. And so engages in, you know, Reform Jewish training from a very young age, and he's very much part of it. And he goes from there to be, you know, the leader of one of the kind of largest and most prominent Reform congregations in New York City, Emmanuel, and he's not, you know, not every rabbi has an obituary in the New York Times when they die. And so how do we square kind of his prominence and people's real robust support for the ways that he engaged with social justice, a term that he also sort of brought into prominence in the Reform movement and in kind of mainstream modern Jewish discourse in the US. How did he sort of negotiate those things, being a leader who didn't believe in hierarchies creating space for other people to articulate their own needs while leading a congregation for some majorly transitional years, right, from 1918 to 1933 in Pittsburgh. This is a shoddy scan, but I wanted to show you the original document that the archives in Cincinnati sent over to me. And yeah, so this is from Rabbi Goldenson's Sunday speeches that he gave. And I think this too is important. These were not, at the end of the Torah service on Saturday, but that this is a series of speeches I'll be referencing that he gave, right, as part of the Rodef tradition. On Sundays, there were very often non-Jews in the audience, just people from Pittsburgh who were interested. And so he also saw himself as a rabbi engaging not just Jews and not just people from his own congregation, but really seeing himself in local and regional context, as we'll see a bit further which we'll see a bit further as we go. Yes, so anarchism, its meanings and its fallacies, right? That's the name of this talk. Exactly to Olivia's question to me, right? Like, can you define anarchism? And so he has this, 1919, he gives this speech. So 102 years ago, Rodef Shalom is in many ways having this same same conversation, right? Where Goldenson is saying, like, hold up, let's define our terms. Why are we so potentially averse to this idea of anarchism? What does it mean? And here's what he says. Human society is a history of revolutions. Israel left Egypt by way of a revolution. Judaism was born in a revolution. Did the voice of God say, go to Egypt and protect Pharaoh, protect the ruling class, protect the landowners? Did it say that? Did it not say rather, go to Egypt, for I have heard the cry of my children who suffer by reason of their taskmasters? Go to Egypt in the very presence of the king and say, send forth my people that they may be free to serve me? That is a genuine religious experience, a genuine revolution on behalf of justice, on behalf of righteousness. You know the experience you had of suffering and persecution in Egypt. You know the importance of the free will. Right? I love that. That was so exciting to me to read, and it really led me to ask, why in 1919 does Rabbi Goldenson feel the need to really defend anarchism, which is getting a pretty bad rap, right? This is a moment in which red listing is beginning to happen. Anarchists and communists are being deported or not allowed into the country if they're trying to immigrate to the US. And there are waves of particularly Jewish artists and writers and journalists and organizers, Emma Goldman very prominently among them, who are being deported for their associations with anarchism. And in this moment, and it should be noted that most of those Jews were Ashkenazi, Eastern European from the Russian Empire, Poland, Lithuania, where Goldenson himself was from, but which was not a region of the world with a strong Reform community or engagement with Reform Judaism. And he says to Rodef Shalom in 1919, this is important. Anarchism is not what the press is saying that it is. And in fact, Judaism is profoundly engaged with anarchism. We have, from our own liturgical context, a way to understand that landowners and taskmasters cannot be the people we're protecting. Judaism was born in a revolution, right? Like, that's a really strong argument to make on almost any pulpit in 1919, and at Rodef, really striking to me. And so then here's where we get a little bit more into the particularity of his labor activism. Let me just check the time real quick. Yes. In 1926, Goldenson gives, as part of this same sort of Sunday speech series, the talk, Am I My Brother's Keeper?, with special reference to the coal strike situation. And the coal strike situation he's talking about is the 2-year strike, 1926 to 28, of bituminous coal workers along sort of the bituminous coals, the Allegheny seam that runs through Western Pennsylvania and south into West Virginia and Kentucky. And I say this because, it's really powerful in a lot of ways. the way actually that I started reading about Goldenson was from this speech where he references directly, but also somewhat obliquely, particularly the strike happening 20 miles away from Pittsburgh in Russellton, which many folks have not heard of. Russellton is a section of what's now West Deer Township, just north of Tarentum, a little ways up the Allegheny River off 28, for those of you with that context. But it was really striking to me, why have I never heard of Russellton? Why had Samuel Goldenson heard of Russellton when that's not really a place where there have been any Jews, as far as I can tell? And I went pretty seriously through the records of coal miners there, trying to see if there were any Jews. But no, Samuel Goldenson appears to have taken very seriously his work as a community member in Western Pennsylvania, not only in the Jewish community, but more broadly. And that too is part of kind of this work of anarchism that he's talking about, where Hashem is the only authority, right? And where Hashem's authority demands justice that landowners and taskmasters are not interested in. And particularly right in the late 20s, those taskmasters here in Western Pennsylvania were the coal companies. Right, and so in this speech, engaging with the coal miners' strike that went on for 2 years, it was known to be very bloody in Russellton, which is kind of like single road town, one rail line through it, only one way in or out, and the coal companies blocked the roads at both ends of town so people couldn't leave, and were hiring basically hitmen to throw people off the train tracks who arrived by train in Russellton trying to support the strike. So this is a really dire situation, and one that is very contained, only 20 miles away from Pittsburgh. And here's what Goldenson has to say about it. It appears inevitable that whatever makes for spiritual thought soon affects economic relationships, and also that whatever happens amid the activities and the processes and purposes of economic life soon influences the spiritual well-being and the ethical consideration of the individual. And then he says, when human beings are in conflict that leads to actual want and misery, to suffering and grief, there is only one thing to do, and that is to follow the intuitions of one's heart, so that no further damage be done and suffering inflicted. This is the moral obligation that is prior to every other one. Right, and so that middle piece where he's arguing sort of materially, I think about in conversation with what Rabbi Levy writes in 1901, where he dismisses anarchism as being concerned merely with the material plane. And then here, Rabbi Goldenson is saying, well, actually, we really have to be concerned with the material plane. And the material plane, to go back to the first quote regarding sort of religion and ethics, is engaged directly with spiritual life. And for him, spiritual life in Jewish tradition demands a material solidarity and mutual aid, right? He says, the matter of sacrifice you and I, as members of the public, must take to ourselves. If we are really in earnest in our desire to lift the burdens from the backs of those heavily tried, we should be willing to bear some of the burden ourselves. And there's more there, but I want to make eye contact again, so I'm gonna come back. And yeah, those words, right, are so striking to me. Goldenson goes on to say very explicitly to his congregation, right, and so this is in 1926, just after sort of the end of the big wave of Jewish migration to the US due to much more restrictive immigration laws that came into place in 1924, which means, and that all has to do sort of with this nativist conservative political sentiment pervasive in the US at that time. But also it means that there are not very many more new Jewish immigrants coming to the US. The Jews who are here are the Jews who are here. And because of the racial politics of this country, have much more access to whiteness and economic stability than many other immigrant groups or racialized groups generally. Right. And, when we think about the Hebrew mutual aid societies that were huge in Pittsburgh, huge really every place where there was major Jewish migration in that period. He says very explicitly to his congregation, hey, we don't need those mutual aid societies right now. Like, we're doing fine. Economically speaking, people in this congregation are probably fine, and we should be sending our money to people who are not doing fine, and those people are the coal miners. And that, to me, is such a direct and thrilling moment of engagement between theology and materiality, and a really material theology of caretaking beyond the bounds of the synagogue or the congregation, right? Remember, even as he's saying this, it's not just Jews in the room. It's not just the people of Rodef Shalom in the room, just as it is not tonight, right? And that, to me, is what's so exciting about Rabbi Goldenson's legacy, right? Because he gets seen doing this work where he's engaged very locally, very specifically in Russellton, PA, which many people who've lived in Allegheny County their whole lives have never heard of because it's really small. R.S. Sukul wrote a really interesting YA book, like a young adult novel about the strike, but that's really all of the historical writing on it. It was suppressed by the mining companies. The only way to learn about it is to go to the Tarentum Public Library and look at the microfilms, because that's what they have still is microfilms, But Rabbi Goldenson, because he went from Pittsburgh to New York City and served at Temple Emmanuel until he died, his speeches are in books and in archives and in libraries, and held up to prominence in a way that was not true for a lot of the other people working in coal miner solidarity. And I should say, I got really excited about this, finding this out, that Rabbi Goldenson had done this, coming back from some coal miner strikes in Eastern Kentucky that were happening in the summer of 2019, 100 years later, when I had this moment of theological impetus toward material solidarity, and then to find that Rabbi Goldenson had been doing this work 100 years ago was both really frustrating in certain ways because, it's been 100 years and things don't change, and really exciting because there's a whole theological underpinning for caretaking. And I think I grew up in a Jewish tradition that certainly talked about tikkun olam and tzedakah, and gave me that framework, but I didn't have a sense for specific examples, and I didn't have a sense for the ways in which Jews, the majority of whom in the US are white, or have access to whiteness in certain ways, and simultaneously are impacted by white supremacy tremendously, and have a very particular, and white supremacist logic places in a very particular position in sort of the American racial capitalist system, that Goldenson is talking about this. He's talking about it really explicitly in a major institution, and saying, we don't have to pretend this isn't happening. We have to say, at this moment in time, 1926, when Rodef Shalom congregation as a whole is relatively economically, which is to say racially secure, he says, we got to do something with this. And I think that to me is it's just really potent, because I think it gives a way to look historically, or to think historically about what to do now. And, there's a lot more I could say about Goldenson. We surely don't have time for it. And, maybe a little bit of Zoom fatigue, but that moment to me, right, in which Goldenson uses his prominence to notice where other people maybe aren't looking, and because of that is invited to serve at one of the even more sort of major sites of Reform Judaism, and shapes a lot of the conversation about what it means to be an ethically engaged Jew, really, for the whole first half of the 20th century, is tremendous. And I was really stunned to learn about this, first just from Googling, and that it was not something that people that, you know, I had learned in my entree to the Jewish community when I moved to Pittsburgh. And like, what, you know, lucky us that we have this history here. And, you know, so what do we do when we have that knowledge, and how does that knowledge change how we engage with being Jews in Pittsburgh in this moment, 100 years after Rabbi Goldenson is writing, and yet at a time that is in many ways so much like that. Yeah, and there's more I could say, but that's what I have for today. And I'm really curious to hear questions and reflections and reactions. And thank you all so much.
Yeah, that's really wonderful presentation, Dee, and so inspiring. And yet again, another lesson for us that we can learn so much from history and from studying our past. And it really holds up a mirror to ourselves that we can reflect in and kind of look at our lives today and what's important for us, and really as a guide for us to understand and to study and to reflect on the past. So with that, I'd invite any questions. You could put them in the chat if you would like, or I got a full screen here, so please raise your hand. And if I don't catch you, just please speak up. Olivia, think you can allow people to unmute themselves. And
Folks should be able to unmute.
And I see Mr. Glick. David Glick, please. You'll need to unmute yourself, please, David.
How about now?
Very good.
Yeah. I think at Rodef Shalom, I believe there's a plaque that says the cause of him who knew not, he sought out. And that reminds me exactly of what grandfather did. These were people that he did not know personally, but he sought out their cause. And I just want to reflect on one thing. As Ron mentioned, grandfather used to come up to our house a lot. And I remember as a young child, I once asked him, I knew he was a revered rabbi, but I'd never seen him preach. And he was just my grandfather, my simple old grandfather who was very loving. And one day I simply asked him, I said, grandfather, tell me what the essence of Judaism is. You know, give me the short form. And I remember he quoted Micah to me. He said, to do justice, to love mercy, love compassion, and walk humbly with thy God. And it's amazing how, coming from someone that I loved and revered so much, that one interaction had an enormous impact on my life. And I think it has undergirded the way I look at the world politically. It's informed probably all the ways I've been involved in political things over the years. And I trace it back to grandfather. And if there's time, I want to mention one other thing, and that is the position grandfather took around Palestine. I don't know if many people know that. And if there's a moment I could talk about that, I think it's an important part of his legacy. Would that be okay?
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
So in 1919, after the Ottoman Empire came apart, there was a question of what's going to happen to Palestine. And grandfather was one of, I don't know how many rabbis, but prominent rabbis, and they sent a letter to President Wilson. And in that letter, they said that they were opposed to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine at that moment. Now remember, this is 1919, because they said, the rabbis said in this letter that the Jews were a tiny minority at that time, and it would not be democratic. So again, there's this issue of democracy. And then in the letter, they said that they feared that if a Jewish state was established in Palestine, that it would give license to those countries that had Jewish citizens when there was a lot of anti-Semitism. It would give them license to expel their Jewish citizens and say, well, you have your own state. And then the rabbis also mentioned that it wasn't clear what the boundary of Palestine was. And so there'd be a lot of conflict about what area are we talking about. And it would never be large enough to to settle all the Jews that might want to leave countries where there was anti-Semitism. So they laid out 4 or 5 issues in 1919 that were so prescient. And so he was part of a group of rabbis that had great concerns with Zionism. And you'd locate him somewhere in the non-Zionist or the anti-Zionist position at that time back in 1919 when he and these rabbis sent that letter to President Wilson.
Thank you for sharing that, David.
Sure, my pleasure.
David, would you say that your grandfather, like, the sort of set the tradition of Rodef Shalom as being an anti-Zionist synagogue at that time?
Well, I suspect that's true. Yes. Yes. And I know in the book of his sermons, which I know Ronnie has and Dan has and I have, there's one of his talks is about Zionism. And so I think it did set the tone for that to happen at Rodef Shalom. But there was a big war going on among the in Judaism between the Zionists and the anti-Zionists, and he was within that segment that had grave concerns about Zionism and the dangers that it would do to Judaism as a religion.
David, what time frame are you talking about?
He wrote the letter that he and the rabbi sent to President Wilson was 1919.
So that was 2 years after the Balfour Declaration.
Correct.
Thank you so much for that invaluable insight into our traditions and the plurality of viewpoints that are possible, and the questions that are still impacting people's lives in Judaism today. I have a question from Bella. What kind of respectability work did rabbis do in the 1900s? And Bella, if you want to share more details about what you mean by respectability work, feel free.
Sure. I'll try to answer that. And Bella, if you have more to say, yeah, I would love it. But yeah, in terms of respectability work, it was not so much, I mean, it was surely individual rabbis, and I think particularly, right, about even the very act of engaging with, Woodrow Wilson, right, writing this letter that, David, you were just talking about, is this really interesting positioning of, rabbi and president kind of in a sort of concert, and I think that that's very tactical, right? I think that's, I don't necessarily think, let me start again on that. I think that engaging in discourse with leading American political figures was one way in which Rabbi Goldenson is saying Jewish thought and Jewish institutions matter to the American institution and belong inside of the American institution, even as he's challenging them. I think, like I said, right, Rabbi Levy, when he's making a very clear, hard differentiation between Judaism and anarchism, he's also implicitly saying there are no anarchist Jews, which we know is not true. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman had just been in Pittsburgh. Alexander Berkman went to jail for trying to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. And the first person to visit Alexander Berkman in jail was a local to Pittsburgh Jewish union steelworker who talks about how his union membership gave him an access to whiteness that his Jewishness at the time did not, because Jewishness was still associated with anarchism. and calling out, he's a union man, stopped an anti-Jewish attack against him on the street in Pittsburgh. And I say that right because very specifically, Rabbi Levy is working to differentiate rabble-rouser and anarchist in the sense of chaos bringer that Olivia mentioned in the chat earlier. Rabbi Levy is working to bifurcate those and say Judaism is religious in a sort of American sense, a legible kind of American Christian sense, and anarchism is this other thing over here. Goldenson does an interesting thing in that, right? He's also like Levy writing to presidents, but he's saying it can also be a lot messier in here. So, respectability is something ongoing, right? And I should say that that's a term that comes out of Black studies, and particularly has to do with talking about the ways in which Black people historically and now in the US kind of negotiate which kinds of Blackness are acceptable under white supremacy. And that term is one that I find very useful in thinking much more broadly about what are the implicit expectations of the culture. All right, now I'm going on. I'm going to stop myself. Okay.
Okay. Other questions?
When was, the attempt for Wilson to get into the form a League of Nations? When was that in relationship to these other events we were talking about? I don't remember what year. I know it was about that time, but I'm not sure just when.
Dee, do you know? It would be right after World War One. I don't know exactly, Arnold. I'm thinking 2019.
No, it would have to be in the teens because Wilson, I think, I'm trying to think. I guess he died in the mid-20s, yeah. But he had a stroke, which I'm not sure when that was. So I don't know that he was in effect doing much of anything in the last part of his term.
I saw a hand up from Zelda Curtis. Do you know?
Wilson fought the 1920 presidential election based on the League of Nations. It was part of the agreement he got at Versailles. Not included in the Versailles Treaty, which was a separate document. It was part of that arrangement, and he fought the election on the idea of the League of Nations.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so let me again express our gratitude to Dee for a wonderful discussion and a really interesting subject matter and a great reflection on another famous rabbi within Rodef Shalom and the impact that they had on their community and certainly on our congregation. Olivia has made a document available for feedback. We would really love your feedback on these lectures. We've gotten some great comments, very instructive, very helpful for us. So I encourage you, if you have just a few minutes, to please fill out a form and give us more of your feedback. And those are very good guideposts for us in terms of designing this lecture series in the future. So we have our next presentation coming up in March. And I think it's March. Olivia, do you know can I call on you, please?
March 16th. We've been on the third Tuesdays, and we actually have Eric Lidji here to share about what the presentation will be on.
Eric?
Hi, everybody. I'm just discovering that I've got a very ethereal look on the Zoom call here because of where the lamp is situated behind my head. Dee, it's so good to see you. I really miss you. You did a great job. Before I plug next month, I'm going to throw something in the chat window. It's the only video that we have in the archive of Dr. Goldenson. And he pops up at around 1 minute and 30 seconds in this video. And the video is from a wonderful relic of the late Gilded Age, Roaring 20s in Pittsburgh, when one Rodef member took about 75 other members on a month-long trip to Paris, all expenses paid. And there's a little image of Dr. Goldenson and his wife kind of wishing everybody off. So next month, I'm going to be talking about, I was asked to talk about Rodef members involved in the early social justice movement in Pittsburgh. And I'll just say going in that I found the scope of that to be so overwhelmingly large that I'm taking a completely sideways approach to the subject matter. And hopefully it will be interesting to all of you and that you won't be disappointed coming expecting one thing and getting another. So that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Really looking forward to it.
That's on the same Zoom link as this one too, so keep it in your pocket and we will see you next month. Dee, if you have any closing thoughts, we would love to hear them.
Just thank you all so much for being here, and I've learned a lot from everyone who's shared, and this is just such a pleasure. And yeah, again, thank you, Olivia, so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Dee.
Thank you, Olivia. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening and
Thank
have a
you all.
wonderful Purim.
Yes.
Everybody.
Good night, Peter. Good night, John.